Well, I'm grateful for the invitation to be here today, and I think Dr. Friedel did a great job of kind of giving a vision of, where we've been, where we've come. I'm going to stick with a TED-style talk today, which is new for me, so thanks, Meg, for challenging me. I want to start by just asking you all to kind of envision what a female elite warfighter is. I know you just saw Sydney up here, but maybe think outside of the box. Envision that woman in your head, and maybe one or two of you share a characteristic of what is the elite female warfighter to you. Anybody? It's supposed to be participation. I know it's after lunch.
Highly fit, physically fit.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Resilience. Okay, great. Great. All right, I want you all to just keep this vision in your head. We're going to come back to it towards the end of my talk. So one of the things I really wanted to do today, let me see. Next slide, maybe? I'm just going to let you handle it up there. One of the things I wanted to really take time and pause, and I think that we sometimes, I know Fiona and I were kind of talking about it at lunch today, we forget that we're in the middle of a change as women, right? It's been a real transformation for women in the last 50 or less years, a metamorphosis of women. So if we go back 50 years, it's the 1970s. Maybe many of you weren't born yet, but at that point, women in terms of advanced degrees, only 7% of physicians were women, 7% of women earning a PhD that was all there was. In terms of lawyers, we only had 3% of women in that profession. And in terms of in the military, we were just coming out of the Vietnam War. Most women were serving as nurses at that time. It was a very different look across the military. The very first women to attend West Point was 1976. In 1980, only half of the women that started in that class actually graduated. So we've come a long way. And in terms of sports, this is a really familiar picture. I'm not sure if you're a marathoner or if you're from Boston. This is Catherine Switzer. And so she's the very first woman to finish the Boston Marathon. And here in Boston, when it gets time for the marathon, we all hashtag 261. It's part of female empowerment, right? This is, as you can see, she's running. There's a runner trying to take her off the course. There's a race official trying to take her off the course. So when we think about these women in the 70s, they're our current leaders, right? Those are the women that have led who we all are today, both military and civilian. Next slide, please. So these are the females of today, right? Today, women are graduating as Rangers. As of last Friday, we have 132 women that wear that tab on their arm. And that's an amazing feat from where we were in the 1970s, right? In terms of this weekend, a great momentous moment for women in sports. Caitlin Clark removed the pronoun. She is now the lead scorer in the Division I basketball. It's no longer a female lead scorer and a male. She is the lead scorer. She amazingly, Pistol Pete held that record back in 1970, and Caitlin Clark took it over this weekend. And so that's a great feat for all of us to be part of. So what happened in the last 50 years? Does anybody know what maybe changed the winds for women in the 1970s? Okay. Anybody else? Birth control? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to take this one for you. 1972, the Title IX law was passed, okay? So I think that had a lot to do with the revolution that we saw with women. So Title IX, was supposed to provide equal opportunities for women in the education environment, but what wasn't really planned but came along with it and did a lot for women is it also opened up a lot of opportunity for women in terms of the sports arena. Next slide, please. So this is a really awesome graphic. The Women's Sports Foundation put together a really great package for the 50th anniversary of Title IX, okay? So what I really want to share is in red are girls and women, participating in sports. And so in 1972 to 2019, that's a 1,000-fold increase in girls participating in sports. And then at the collegiate level, from 1972 to 2001, that's a 500% increase in women. So what comes with those athletic opportunities? A scholarship, right? So now all of these women maybe have opportunities not only to improve athletically in their performance, but also educational opportunities to advance themselves in the trajectory of women. So I feel Title IX did a lot, as well as birth control, to help women kind of that forward momentum. So do you think that these opportunities that came about in the 70s and in the 80s for women came with social acceptance and support? Or do you think it came with conflict and hardship? Okay, think back to Catherine Switzer. Those women that were the first to break the glass ceiling in their profession or their sports had a lot to deal with, which is kind of what we were hearing today. I think we had a great session this morning. I think Joan really started us off on the right foot, and I think we've really been able to talk about some of these opportunities, but also the shift in like the characteristics and what builds these women of today, right? So that was really interesting to me and to my lab. I'm a scientist, and so we're very interested in those first few women that actually were pioneers in some of the once male-dominant leadership training courses. So the Ranger School, the Marine Infantry Officer course, and we really wanted to try to figure out, what are the characteristics of these female elite warfighters that made them successful? Are they the same as average women in the Army? Are they different? Are they similar to men? And so we asked women that had graduated from Ranger School, Marine Infantry Officer course, or if there had been any SEALs, to come to our lab and spend a couple days with us and let us measure them, test them, and just kind of figure out if there's patterns between these women, and see if we could share any kind of information with those that are coming up behind them. And at the time that I wrote the protocol, I think there were maybe 8, and we were thinking of calling it the Crazy 8. And I think by the time that we were actually collecting data, the number kept growing. And by the time we finished, there were 75 women that would have qualified. So 20% of those women actually came and participated in the study out of the goodness of their heart, just to share some of the characteristics that make them who they are. And so what we found is that, so when I say 20%, it was 13 women, okay? 12 of them were Rangers. We had 1 Marine that participated. 12 out of the 13 were officers, which means they all had college degrees. And 4 of them graduated from West Point. We had 50% that either had already accomplished or were working towards their advanced degrees. More than 60% of them played some kind of varsity sport in high school or in college. And it's also noteworthy that 2 of them actually went through Ranger School as mothers of very young children. And so that's also something just to kind of keep in the back of your mind when we talk about some of what these women look like. Everybody wants to know what they look like, how do they perform. So, what do you expect? Do you expect them to perform as well or better than women on average in the Army? Next slide, please. So the women were built, we called them the few. We kind of coined it because female elite warfighters, and there was only a few of them. So I'm going to refer to them as the few throughout. We measured their bodies. It's probably one of the most easiest things to do to, quantify what they look like. And they were larger almost everywhere than the average Army female, except for their waist, their hips, and their thighs, which is a completely different TED Talk about body composition. But they, on average, they were, tall, and they weighed more. They weighed 15 pounds on average, more than the average female soldier at the time. And if we look back to the 1970s, they outweighed them by 20 pounds. But then we put them on the DEXA scanner, which is how we measure, the most accurate way to measure, I guess, body composition in the lab. And they measured at 20% body fat on average. So we all have the tables from 600-9 in our head. That equates to 17, 18, 19-year-old man. All right, very lean, very fit. And when we consider like they were outweighing average military Army women, the difference in their body fat was 8 to 10% different than women in the Army at that time, and then from the 1970s. So that just shows you how their bodies are very different. So then we wanted to, the next easiest thing to do as an exercise physiologist, throw them on the treadmill. Let's see how fit they are, or let's measure them against some other, the other tests that we have so we can compare. So we looked at their VO2 max, which is how we can kind of equate them to other athletes in terms of their endurance or their aerobic capacity. Next slide, please. And so what we found is that when we compare their VO2 absolute output values, they are extremely fit, and they're most comparable to world-class distance runners, you know, and that is just taking their absolute values. When we then kind of looked at how they perform in the military in terms of military-specific tasks, we asked them to complete a 4-mile loaded ruck, a casualty drag, and of course the ACFT, because it was new, right? So this was in 2019. So 2019, 2020 was when we were collecting the data. So what we found is when we compared the few women to the average Army female and the average Army male values for these three soldier-specific tests, the few women outperformed all of the average Army women values on all tasks, and performed as well, if not better, than the males in all these tasks. So their total ACFT score. The only event that males did better was the standing power throw, which we all know is a difficult one to master, and then the casualty drag. The men were a little bit quicker than the women. So kind of as you would expect, you know, we heard strong, maybe larger, you know, these women were performing extremely well. You know, did it have to do with their athletic opportunities? Did it have to do with their education, that they knew that there was, you know, studies out there that they could train up to be, you know, as strong as men? We thought maybe it might go a little bit deeper, and so we also wanted to look at some of those intrinsic characteristics. And so, you know, if you think about being successful in the Ranger course, that's 62 days, or the Marine Infantry Officer course, you can fake it till you make it at the beginning. You look good, you look big, people are gonna, you know, kind of gravitate towards you. But people have to follow you. It's leadership school, right? So it has to be a little bit deeper than that. So we really wanted to get at that. So I want to give a shout out to Bill Therian, who's here in the audience today. He really helped us take some of the qualitative data and make it quantitative. So from surveys and from one-on-one interviews, we were able to kind of crack the nut of some of these women and kind of look at unique patterns of what makes them tick, what's in their mind. Next slide, please. So the female elite warfighters had really high determination and grit, which is something that Sydney shared with us this morning. Probably greater grit than male candidates that were selected for Special Forces assessment and selection. Greater than emergency room doctors when we're able to compare them. Above average resilience, these women, you know, were very similar to the SFAS selected males. What was really unique was one of the really resilience surveys that we were able to use showed this extreme level of the women being accepting challenges or willingness to accept challenges. And so this kind of aligned with our interviews with them when we asked, you know, hey, what made you want to go to Ranger School? What made you want to, you know, toe the line of that, you know, the RPA the first day as the first woman, and it was their response was it was a challenge. You know, everyone said it was hard. I wanted to see how hard it was. Could I really do it? 85% of the women just were up for the challenge. And another piece that we kind of draw in here to their willingness to accept challenges, many of the women, more than 50%, said that they had some kind of a hardship that they had to overcome in their life as a young adult or as a child. And so our team feels that probably plays a lot into their character and the person that they grow into. So I want you to remember back to that picture of Catherine Switzer and her running the 26.2 miles with runners and race directors trying to get her off the course. Think of the hardship and overcoming adversity for the 26.2 miles running into Boston. It's interesting, right? There's some overlap between women in the 70s and even women, 5 or 6 years ago going through ranger training. Next slide, please. So one of the other pieces that I asked the women when I interviewed them was, can you just give me one word to describe yourself or your characteristics? So self-report. And in orange or in yellow up here, I have, 50% of the women describe themselves as competitive, and I want to validate that by saying not competitive with others, not competitive with other women, competitive with themselves. They always wanted to do better. They weren't going to run a road race unless they were going to PR, and if they weren't going to PR, they probably weren't going to finish the race. They wanted to be the best. They didn't want to be the they wouldn't want to be the best woman at land nav. They wanted to be the best at land nav. That was very important to them, that there was no qualifier, that they were the best woman at something. They wanted to have the best ACFT score, do the most leg tucks. Like, that's what was important. And so when we talked to them and we figured out, a lot of the similarities and the strategies that they used, which I heard this morning from Sydney, is a lot of the women that were successful in Ranger School and in Infantry Officer course was a lot of self-talk. Most of them, in some way or another, mentioned that the word quit was just not in their vocabulary. They weren't going to set themselves up to go to Ranger School if they knew they couldn't finish. Number one, because they had a lot of people that were watching them. Number two, they had this dedication to others, whether it was mentors or family members, and they didn't want to let anybody down. And they really had this extreme focus. I mean, if you remember me mentioning, 2 of the women that went through Ranger School had very young children, under 10. When they went to Ranger School, they didn't know if they were going to be in for 3 months or they were going to be in for 9 months, right? So they had to have extreme focus. They had to have confidence and support on the outside. So these are all kind of things that go into the woman that actually is elite, right? It's not all on the exterior. It's not all her physical abilities or her body measurements. It's a lot of what's inside, and that is something that's really hard as a scientist to capture and to compare and to share. So I want you to think back to that vision at the very beginning of my time with you and say, how did you do? When you thought about that elite female warfighter, did you think about external, intrinsic factors that defined her? And I hope that my time with you, you maybe start to think about the holistic picture of the elite female warfighter. And I want to just end my talk with one message, I guess. Next slide, please. Is that, really what we need to think about is kind of the work that goes behind the scenes for our women, in terms of, it's a progression. It's not just, combat arm MOSs are open to all women, but it takes the leaders opening those opportunities up to women, but it also takes the individual. And so being ready to accept those challenges and move into that environment, because it is a lot to carry on the shoulders, and it's tiring. And we want to make sure that these women are supported and that they have all the resources that they need to give back and mentor, right? So as a mentor, as a leader, as a parent today, I really just want you to think about continuing to feed the opportunities to women, to minorities, and just with an open mind and with patience, because it might take a little while to fill those slots at Ranger School because the women are preparing for it. And what we see is that the women are very successful when they're ready, right? So support our peers. Let's rise to the challenge, because together I think we're a much stronger team.